If someone asked why Paragon Park closed, most people would give a simple answer. A developer came along with a checkbook and the owners were tired. That's true as far as it goes. But the real story stretches across 80 years, and it involves fire, flood, a family that couldn't agree, a blizzard that turned the Atlantic Ocean into an uninvited guest, and one wooden roller coaster that refused to die. The closing wasn't one decision. It was the last in a long, long line of them, some made in boardrooms and some made by the weather. And to understand any of it, you have to go back to a time when the beach at Hull, Massachusetts, was the most exciting place a Bostonian could reach in an afternoon. In the late 19th century, the Nantasket area of Hull was already drawing summer crowds. Grand hotels lined the shore. Steamships carried passengers from Rose Wharf in Boston on a 15-mile cruise past the harbor islands, and by the time you stepped off the gangplank at Nantasket Pier, you could smell the salt air and hear the surf. The neck of land the Wampanoag people had called Nantasket was, by the 1890s, a resort for the well-to-do and the working class alike, with dance halls, bathhouses, and a stretch of sandy beach that ran for miles. But there were also taverns and rougher establishments, and when the Metropolitan Park Commission acquired 25 acres of shoreline in 1900, it was partly to clean the place up. The Olmsted brothers, the same landscape architects who shaped Boston's Emerald Necklace, were hired to design the new public park along the beach. Hull was becoming respectable. It was also becoming a place where a man with enough ambition and enough money could build something people would talk about for generations. George A. Dodge was that man. A former whaling captain from Boston, Dodge had made his fortune selling whalebone, a material so versatile in the Victorian era that historians have called it the plastic of its day, used in everything from corsets to umbrella ribs to buggy whips. By the turn of the century, the whalebone trade was waning, but Dodge was wealthy and restless, looking for something to build. A friend of his had invested in a small collection of amusements at Nantasket, licensed from George C. Tilleux's famous Steeplechase Park at Coney Island. Tilleux was one of the great showmen of the age, a man who rivaled P.T. Barnum in his ability to separate crowds from their money while leaving them delighted about it. His patented attractions carried names like Funny Stairway, Earthquake Floor, Third Degree Room, and Revolving House of Delusion, and the centerpiece was a metal track horse race inspired by the old English steeplechase. These Nantasket versions were popular enough, but Dodge saw something bigger. When his friend ran into financial trouble, Dodge stepped in, bought into the venture, and then began planning a grander vision entirely, a self-contained amusement park on the vacant land surrounding the existing attractions and the old Rockland House Hotel on the hill behind them. He assembled investors to form the Eastern Park Construction Company, leased roughly 10 acres from the old Colony Railroad, and poured approximately $500,000 into construction. That was a staggering sum in 1905. On Saturday, June 10th of that year, Paragon Park opened its gates. The press called it a miniature World's Fair, and that was no idle comparison. Dodge had modeled his park directly on the World's Columbian Exposition of 1893, the Chicago fair that had introduced America to the concept of the Midway, a boulevard of attractions flanking a central promenade. Just as the Columbian Exposition's famous White City had surrounded a grand lagoon, Paragon Park had its own saltwater lagoon at its center. Rising from beside it was an electric tower that stood 110 feet tall, the tallest structure at Nantasket Beach, adorned with 20,000 electric lights. At a time when most American homes still lacked electricity, that tower blazing against the night sky must have looked like the future itself. Opening day brought a Japanese village, Italian gondoliers gliding across the lagoon, an Egyptian exhibit called the Streets of Cairo, camel rides, wild animal shows, acrobats, high divers, and a 2,000-seat German beer garden called the Palm Garden. The entertainment at the Palm Garden was ambitious enough to rival Boston theaters. Paragon sat on the same performance circuit, booking nationally known acts alongside an in-house song and dance troupe. A visitor in those first years could eat, drink, watch a show, stroll through an exotic foreign bazaar, and never feel the need to leave the grounds. The Boston Globe, impressed, compared it favorably to Luna Park at Coney Island, about the highest praise an amusement park could receive. And yet, within 2 years, Paragon was falling short of its financial projections. The investors wanted out. Dodge, undeterred, bought them all out in 1907. He believed in what he had built, and he was willing to bet his own money on it. That decision, one man's stubbornness against the arithmetic, would define the park's next decade. Dodge threw himself into the operation, changing exhibits annually, adding rides, tinkering constantly. Then, in 1911, fire struck for the first time. It leveled buildings along Nantasket Avenue from the entrance southward. In the aftermath, Dodge built a new dance hall and installed a roller coaster called the Green Streak in the front of the park, replacing an older figure-8 model that had stood near the Palm Garden. The park recovered, as it would recover again and again. But only a few years later, another fire roared through, destroying the Green Streak, the signature front entrance, and much of the Nantasket Avenue frontage. Fire was becoming a recurring character in this story, and it had not yet finished its work. Here is where one particular detail becomes important, because it connects to something that would matter 70 years later. The man who had been managing and operating the Green Streak was a young engineer named Herbert Schmeck, working for the Philadelphia Toboggan Company. Schmeck was only in his 20s, but he had caught the attention of the company's president, Henry B. Auchie. When Dodge decided to rebuild after the fire, he didn't just want a replacement coaster. He wanted the tallest roller coaster in the world. Dodge contracted with the Philadelphia Toboggan Company, and the designer they assigned was John A. Miller, one of the most important figures in roller coaster history. The man who, 7 years earlier, had invented the safety ratchet, the device on the underside of coaster cars that makes that distinctive clinkety-clank sound as you climb the lift hill. Miller's design for Paragon was a double out-and-back coaster, a side friction model that stood 98 feet tall. Schmeck supervised its construction. On May 26, 1917, the giant coaster opened to the public, and for the next 8 years, it held the title of the tallest roller coaster on Earth. Riders experienced a vertical drop of 88 feet and speeds that reportedly reached 53 miles per hour. From a distance, the wooden framework could be seen for miles along the coast, rising above the flat peninsula like the skeleton of some immense creature hauled up from the sea. That coaster, the giant, became Paragon Park. More than the carousel, more than the Midway Games, more than the fried clams or the saltwater taffy pulled in machines visible through the shop windows. For nearly 7 decades, it was the thing children saw first when their parents' car crested the hill, and the thing they talked about on the drive home. One visitor from those years recalled that as a child, riding toward the park, he could see the coaster on the horizon long before they arrived, and it seemed to grow taller with every mile. Around 1915, Dodge had begun stepping back from the day-to-day management of the park. He had other interests. In 1912, he had opened the Hotel Georgian in Park Square, an upscale night spot in Boston's theater district that he operated until Prohibition forced it to close in 1919. He leased portions of Paragon's operation to David Stone, a fruit peddler, and Albert A. Golden, a fellow hotelier. By 1920, Stone and Golden were running the entire Paragon operation under a sublease. Dodge still held the primary lease from the railroad, and they subleased from him. It was a layered, complicated arrangement, and it was about to get more complicated. On September 20th, 1922, George Dodge died of Bright's disease in a New Hampshire hospital. He was 68. The man who had built Paragon Park from whalebone money and sheer will was gone, and the question of who truly owned the park and the land beneath it became urgent. David Stone's son Joseph entered into negotiations with the Old Colony Railroad to purchase the property outright. Shortly after the railroad signed the paperwork the following March, fire broke out again. On March 28, 1923, flames ripped through Paragon, causing an estimated $500,000 in damage, essentially the same sum Dodge had invested to build the park in the first place. The fire destroyed much of the southern end of the park and the cottages along the road toward Atlantic Hill. David Stone lost 2 houses. It took 2 years before Stone and Golden could fully assume control. canceling the old lease and beginning improvements to the fire-ravaged grounds. Their most significant purchase came in 1928 when they bought a new carousel from the Philadelphia Toboggan Company. It was designated PTC number 85, the 85th carousel the company had built. It arrived with 66 hand-carved wooden horses, 2 Roman chariots, 36 carved cherubs, 18 goddesses, and 35 original paintings on its rounding boards. It replaced an earlier carousel run by a concessionaire named John J. Hurley. That new carousel would outlast the park itself, and its survival is a story with at least 3 separate chapters, but those come later. The following year, 1929, brought trouble that no amount of rebuilding could fix. On Thanksgiving Day, a fire at nearby Nantasket Pier destroyed most of the fleet of steamboats that had been carrying passengers between Boston and the beach for decades. The fire didn't touch the park, but it severed a lifeline. The Nantasket Beach Steamboat Company struggled for years before going bankrupt. The Old Colony Railroad suspended train service in 1932, replacing it with bus routes from Nantasket Junction in Hingham. Within 5 years, the rail line was abandoned entirely. Parts of its track bed would later be absorbed into the footprint of the amusement park itself. The Turnpike Cars Ride and the Magic Mine Train eventually occupied land where trains had once run. The Depression weighed heavily on the park. In 1931, David and Rose Stone created the Paragon Park Operating Company to shield their ownership from creditors. Debts from the purchase of the park were extended and renegotiated. Even the repeal of Prohibition in 1933, which allowed the park to sell liquor again, offered only marginal relief. In 1932, Herbert Schmeck, the same man who had supervised the giant coaster's original construction 15 years earlier, now a senior engineer at PTC, returned to Paragon to overhaul the coaster. He converted it from a side friction design to an under-friction track system, which fundamentally changed the ride experience. What had been a scenic, relatively gentle trip became a genuine thrill ride, the cars now locked to the track in a way that allowed for steeper drops and faster turns. The giant coaster had survived its third fire and emerged transformed. A brightly colored Art Deco entrance was erected in 1937, replacing the stone-carved entrance that Hugh Cairns had designed 20 years earlier. That Art Deco entrance, with its bold colors, streamlined lettering, and geometric shapes, became the image most people carried in their minds when they thought of arriving at Paragon Park. It was the gate you walked through on the way to everything else. Postcards featured it. Families posed for photographs in front of it. For a park that had already burned and rebuilt itself multiple times, it represented a fresh start, a declaration that the place was still worth dressing up for. The partnership between Stone and Golden had formally dissolved around 1925, but ownership of the land remained divided. The Stones controlled the main park property, the rear parking lots, and the warehouse. Golden held the section of former railroad bed and the row of storefronts along Nantasket Avenue from the front entrance northward to the Fascination Parlor. To most visitors, the split was invisible. You walked through the gate and it was all Paragon. War rationing during the 1940s put further strain on operations. Then came personal losses that thinned the family's ranks. David Stone died during the off-season in Miami in 1946. 3 years later, his eldest son, Joseph, died in the middle of the 1949 season, right in the thick of the summer rush, with the park full of visitors. That left Joseph's younger brother, Larry, just 30 years old, and their 73-year-old mother, Rose, to carry on the business. By 1951, the Stones had finally consolidated full ownership of the land, buying out the Golden family's share. Through the 1950s, Paragon evolved into something more recognizable as a mid-century amusement park. The exotic exhibitions and World's Fair atmosphere of the early decades gradually gave way to a tighter focus on rides, games, and food. Cape Cod was becoming the preferred vacation destination for families who now owned automobiles, and the loss of the steamboat service and the railroad had changed the calculus of getting to Hull. But Paragon still drew crowds from Boston and the South Shore. families who packed 6 kids into a station wagon and drove to Nantasket for the day, windows down, the smell of the ocean hitting them before they could even see the water. People from those years often mention that moment, the first whiff of salt air, and then, seconds later, the sound of screaming from the coaster, carrying across the flat marshland before the park came into view. The boardwalk vendors sold fried clams, hot dogs, and saltwater taffy pulled in machines visible through shop windows. You could stand and watch the mechanical arms stretching the candy into long, glistening ropes. The penny arcade had skee-ball alleys and pinball machines, and the clatter of wooden balls rolling up the ramp was so constant it became part of the background noise, like the surf. There was a miniature golf course tucked directly under the roller coaster, which must have been a peculiar experience, lining up a putt on a windmill hole while the wooden structure above you thundered and shook, shadows of the cars flickering across the artificial turf as they hurtled past overhead. By the late 1950s, the park had settled into a rhythm that would hold, more or less, for the next 2 decades. The flat rides rotated through, the tilt-a-whirl, the scrambler, the roundup that pinned you against the wall while the floor dropped away. The Ferris wheel offered views of the beach and the harbor islands. The paratrooper lifted umbrella-shaped seats that tilted and spun. There were kiddie rides for the younger children, smaller versions of the adult attractions. And on any given Saturday in July, the Midway was dense with families moving between them, cotton candy in hand, trying to decide what to ride next. In the mid-1960s, Boston radio station WBZ began broadcasting live from the park during the summer, setting up a trailer they called the Sundeck Studio, outfitted with broadcasting equipment and parked right on the Midway. Visitors could watch the disc jockeys at work through the trailer's windows while the sounds of the park, the carousel organ, the screams from the giant coaster, the bells of the Midway games, bled into the broadcast. For listeners at home, tuning in must have been almost as good as being there. But 1963 was the year fire returned with a vengeance, and this time it came 3 times. The first blaze, which the Hull fire chief described as a roaring inferno, tore through the Arcade Bazaar and Funland, a toy store and group of attractions just up Nantasket Avenue from the park. Damage estimates exceeded $300,000. About a month later, a far worse fire destroyed much of the giant coaster, the station, the trains, the double helix finale, and part of the lift hill. It also consumed the Art Deco front entrance and concessions along the front of the park. Crews worked around the clock to get the coaster running again. This is where the story takes a turn that coaster enthusiasts still talk about. The park called the Philadelphia Toboggan Company and asked its president, John C. Allen, to rebuild the giant as it had been. Allen provided an estimate, but it was more than the park could afford. So instead, he designed a shortened version, the same lift hill, the same first drop, but without the 2 bunny hops and the signature helix finale that had been the ride's dramatic conclusion since 1917. It was a compromise born of financial necessity, and it altered the character of the ride. The giant was still tall, still fast, still thrilling, but riders who remembered the old version knew something was missing at the end. A long, accelerating spiral that had pressed you against the side of the car before the brakes caught you. That helix would not return to the coaster for another 23 years, and by then, the coaster would be in a different state entirely. There was also the matter of the trains. The 1963 fire had destroyed the giant's original rolling stock. Rather than buy expensive new trains from PTC, the park acquired used trains from the Comet, a roller coaster at Forest Park Highlands in St. Louis, which had survived a massive fire at that park on July 19, 1963, only to be torn down in 1968. The Comet's trains fit the giant's track, but they arrived with the word Comet painted across the front car. Paragon never removed the name. The station still had a sign that read Giant Coaster. For the next 2 decades, visitors called the ride by whichever name they preferred, the Giant or the Comet, and arguments about the correct name became a minor tradition in themselves. A third fire struck in the fall of 1963, destroying the Chateau ballroom at the rear of the park. Lost in that blaze was the holiday inventory of Toy-A-Rama, a seasonal store in what had been the park's roller rink. In the space of a single year, fire had reshaped Paragon more drastically than at any point since 1923. The rebuilding that followed was functional rather than beautiful. The ornate Art Deco entrance was gone. In its place, silver-colored flagpoles stretched across the opening, enclosed by chain-link gates that swung inward. The new buildings were flat-roofed, single-story concrete block structures, fire-resistant, cheap, and entirely without charm. Walking through that entrance in the years after 1963 was a different experience than it had been before. The park worked. It was still fun, but something of its visual personality had been stripped away, replaced by the architecture of pragmatism. Visitors who had known the old entrance sometimes paused at the new one, as if expecting something more, before the sounds and smells of the midway pulled them inside. The giant coaster itself had been shortened, not dramatically, but enough that experienced riders noticed. The approach into the brake run was now an angled straightaway rather than the spiraling helix that had been the ride's dramatic crescendo. It still delivered thrills. It still towered over the beach. But the ending felt like a sentence with the last few words cut off. And because the replacement train still bore the name Comet on the front car, the ride now carried a kind of double identity. Its station sign saying one thing, its train saying another. Some visitors never knew the difference. Others felt it keenly. Through the late 1960s and into the 1970s, relatively little changed except the names and locations of some rides. The Turnpike Cars, an automobile-themed ride on the old railroad bed, was replaced by the Indy 500 in the 1970s. The water ride went through so many identities over the years that keeping track of its names is itself a kind of archaeology. It was the Red Mill, then the Mill Rapids, then the Jungle Ride, then the Congo Cruise, and finally the Bermuda Triangle. The Kooky Castle, a horror-themed dark ride, drew lines of teenagers daring each other to go in. The Skylark, a ski lift-style ride that carried passengers above the midway, gave an aerial view of the whole operation. The clutter of rides and booths below, the beach beyond them, the ocean beyond that. Former employees from those years recalled an unwritten code among the ride operators. If you worked at the park and showed up at the giant coaster on your break, the crew would let you ride for free, just to cool off on a hot day. The same courtesy applied to the Tunnel of Love boat ride, though the motivations there were presumably different. When Rose Stone died in 1969, the park lost its last direct link to the era when George Dodge was still alive and involved. She had been a familiar figure around the grounds for nearly 50 years. Her passing was quiet, undramatic, but it marked a kind of generational boundary. The park was now fully in the hands of Larry Stone and his wife Phyllis, and the challenges ahead would test them in ways that fire never had. On February 6, 1978, the great blizzard hit New England. It was one of the worst storms in the region's history. 54 deaths across the area, millions of dollars in property damage, over 3,500 cars stranded on the highways. In Hull, the Atlantic Ocean and Hull Bay converged on the narrow peninsula from both sides. Paragon Park went under 6 feet of water. The National Guard patrolled the town. Schools were closed for 2 weeks. Homes in the Pemberton area burned because floodwaters prevented firefighters from reaching the hydrants. At the park, the damage was of a kind the Stones had never dealt with before. Fire, for all its violence, leaves behind a clear aftermath. What's burned is removed and replaced. But saltwater flooding was insidious. The motors and machinery of most rides were ruined. Arcade games, prize inventory, electrical systems, all of it needed to be torn out and replaced. The buildings themselves had to be dried out over weeks. One park employee, who also served as a selectman in Hull, recalled the surreal dual role of helping the town recover while directing cleanup crews at the park. He described seeing heavy wooden picnic tables, the kind that normally took 4 men to move, having been thrown over an 8-foot fence by the storm surge and deposited at the far end of the park. Miraculously, Paragon opened on time for the 1978 season. On July 30th, the town hosted Hull Appreciation Day, inviting disaster relief workers back for a day at the beach and free rides at the park. The governor came and praised the town's resilience. Bumper stickers reading, "Thanks a whole ava lot," were sold to raise money for the Red Cross. It was a proud moment, a story of survival. But behind the scenes, the survival was fragmenting. Larry and Phyllis Stone had decided to divorce. The park was a family business, and now the family was splitting. The game's manager, who happened to be Phyllis's brother-in-law, found himself caught between the two owners and eventually left after 30 years. Day-to-day management became a source of friction rather than cooperation. Neither of the Stones' two children showed interest in carrying on the business. Around this same time, a movement within Hull to legalize casino gambling complicated the park's future. Was Paragon destined to become a cornerstone of a casino economy, or was its presence an obstacle to bigger development? Some in town saw the aging park as a relic holding back the peninsula's potential. Others saw it as exactly what made Hull worth visiting. The question lingered unresolved until 1982, when the election of gambling opponent Michael Dukakis as governor effectively ended any casino dreams for the area. The park was left in a kind of limbo, too old to compete, too familiar to abandon, its future dependent on owners who were running out of reasons to keep going. By the early 1980s, the Stones faced a stark calculation. Years of deferred maintenance had accumulated, paint peeled, ride mechanisms needed overhaul. The wooden structure of the coaster required constant attention. Every off-season, crews would inspect and replace boards, tighten bolts, shore up supports. The park was only open a few months each year, but the costs of insurance, repairs, and modernization were year-round problems. The price of a single new ride had climbed into the millions. Liability insurance for thrill parks was rising steeply. Larger theme parks, Six Flags, Disney, were drawing visitors away from traditional seaside parks with their bigger budgets, cleaner facilities, and relentless marketing. Friends and family recalled the Stones saying privately at the end of each season that it would be the last. Rumors of potential buyers surfaced occasionally, but nothing materialized. And each spring the chain-link gates would swing open again. The entrance, those chain-link gates behind the silver flagpoles, had become something less than welcoming. Where once there had been carved stone and then bold Art Deco lettering, now there was fencing. It still worked. People still walked through, but the invitation had changed. In 1984, the Massachusetts real estate market was booming. The very factors that had limited Paragon's ability to expand, the narrow strip of land between the ocean and the bay, now made the property enormously valuable. Chester Kahn, a condominium developer whose summer home was one block from the Stones' Hull residence, saw the opportunity. He knew something crucial. The town's zoning rules for the park property had no height limit. Kahn proposed twin 18-story towers, each double the height of the giant coaster's first hill. For Larry and Phyllis Stone, the offer represented something they could finally agree on. They were both exhausted. The purchase price was $5.5 million, enough for both of them to retire comfortably. In late 1984, they accepted. The news broke in December 1984, not in the local paper, but in the New England Real Estate Journal, a trade publication that most Hull residents would never see. A reader tipped off the Hull Nantasket Times, which went to press a day early to break the story on January 2, 1985. A condominium developer planned to tear down Paragon Park. There was an immediate flicker of hope. Surely there would be a final season, a summer of goodbyes. But within weeks, Kahn and the Stones moved up the closing date. Opening the park to nostalgic crowds, souvenir hunters, and potential vandals seemed too risky. The sale would close in March. There would be no last ride. Without even knowing it, the people who had spent their summers at Paragon Park had already had their last summer there. The final season had been 1984, and nobody had thought to memorialize it because nobody knew. On Wednesday, June 12, 1985, hundreds of former employees, nostalgic visitors, and amusement park operators from across the country stood in the rain and watched as the contents of Paragon Park were auctioned off, piece by piece. Ticket booths, ride equipment, signs bearing the Paragon name, bumper car vehicles, sections of track from the Himalaya ride. One bidder paid $25 for the entire lot of rainbow-colored trash cans. A man bought a section of the midway fencing and carried it to his car. The auction catalog listed everything with the clinical precision of an estate sale. Lot numbers assigned to things that had once been backdrops to first dates, birthday celebrations, and the best days of childhood summers. The most consequential bid of the day came from Mark Mason, the manager of Wild World, a small amusement park near Baltimore. He paid $28,000 for the giant coaster. He announced plans to dismantle it piece by piece and rebuild it in Maryland. To people who had grown up watching that wooden skeleton rise from the Nantasket horizon, the idea that it could be taken apart and reassembled 450 miles away seemed almost unbelievable. But it happened. Charlie Dinn of the Dinn Corporation supervised the relocation, and designer Curtis Summers reworked sections of the layout. The coaster's length grew from roughly 3,400 feet to 4,000 feet in the reconstruction. Most remarkably, Summers restored the helix finale that had been lost in the 1963 fire, that long, accelerating spiral that Paragon visitors hadn't experienced in over 2 decades. On May 3, 1986, the coaster reopened as the Wild One at what would eventually become Six Flags America. The helix was back. The first drop was back. The clinkety-clank of the chain pulling the cars up the lift hill, the sound that John Miller's safety ratchet had made possible back in 1910, was back. Just not in Massachusetts. The Wild One operated in Maryland for nearly 40 years, until Six Flags America closed permanently in November 2025. As of that closure, the future of the 108-year-old coaster remains uncertain, a ride that has now outlived 2 parks. Meanwhile, in Hull, the fight over what would replace the park was far from over. The closure had unleashed a frenzy of real estate speculation across the town. Within months, new development proposals seemed to appear weekly. Nantasket Place, River Crossing, Ocean Place, Sea Watch, Marina Beach, Mariner's Landing, and more. Condominiums were already going up on Atlantic Hill and Telegraph Hill. The removal of what some developers frankly called the honky-tonk amusements, combined with the zoning loophole that Kahn's plans had exposed, turned Hull into a gold rush for builders. Selling the 18-story towers to the public proved harder than Kahn and his partner Quinn had imagined. Even a compromise reduction to 12 stories faced stiff opposition. The developers claimed they had received at least 100 deposits from potential buyers, but many in Hull remained unconvinced. By late 1985, Kahn and Quinn abruptly canceled the high-rise development entirely and announced they would sell the carousel at auction in 28 days. The carousel, PTC number 85, 66 wooden horses, hand-carved in 1928. If the giant coaster was Paragon's spine, the carousel was its heart, and now it was about to be scattered to the winds. Preservationists mobilized. An activist who had first raised the alarm in February led a publicity and fundraising campaign that generated awareness, but fell well short of the carousel's estimated $1 million valuation. In a dramatic finish, 3 local businessmen pooled their resources and submitted the winning bid of $598,800, just $1,200 short of their credit limit. The carousel was saved. It was moved down the block the following spring to a pavilion beside the old railroad station and its clock tower, where it reopened to the public. The developers, meanwhile, returned with a scaled-down plan, a 7-story, 112-unit brick building fronting Nantasket Avenue. The Horizons at Paragon Park, as it was called, was completed in 1988. The planned second building at the rear of the site never materialized. The real estate market crashed, and the developers lost control of the property. The carousel operated as a private business until 1996, when the 3 businessmen who had purchased it decided to sell. Yet another campaign was launched, the third rescue, if you count the initial effort to keep it in Hull. This time, the result was the formation of the Friends of the Paragon Carousel, a nonprofit that purchased the ride for $1.1 million. The Friends continued to operate it, eventually opening a small museum of Paragon memorabilia in 2013 in the adjacent clock tower building. Inside the museum, visitors could watch James Hardison, a restoration artist, painstakingly restoring each of the 66 wooden horses to their original condition. The work continued for years, horse by horse, layer by layer of old paint stripped away to reveal the original carving beneath. The carousel drew as many as 100,000 visitors each summer. It was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1999. For people who remembered Paragon, riding it was the closest thing to going back. The same horses, the same organ music, the same gentle centrifugal pull. Everything else was gone. The midway, the kooky castle, the scrambler, the smell of fried clams mixing with ocean air. But the horses still went around. The remains of the turnpike car's roadway, overgrown with weeds, could still be spotted from certain angles beside the parking lot, visible on satellite images like the outline of something buried. The Fascination Parlor, one of the last holdouts from the boardwalk era, closed in 2019 after storm damage. The Dream Machine Arcade lasted longer, along Nantasket Avenue where the Art Deco entrance had once stood, and before that the carved stone entrance, and before that the ornate original gate of 1905, there were condominiums. The view from the beach, where once the giant coaster had risen like a bleached dinosaur skeleton, a phrase one Boston newspaper had used, was now a wall of residential buildings. For years after the park closed, former employees held annual reunions at a pavilion across Nantasket Avenue from where the park had been. They would gather on a summer evening, people who had operated the rides and run the games and sold the tickets, and they would look across the street at the condominiums and talk about what used to be there. One account mentioned that on hot nights, from the right angle, you could still catch the faintest trace of the old Midway's geometry in the layout of the parking lots and sidewalks. The curve of a path that once led to a ride, the width of a gap between buildings that matched the old corridor to the beach. In March 2025, the remaining Paragon Boardwalk area, the former Midway zone, the last physical footprint of the park beyond the carousel, was demolished to make way for a new mixed-use development, 132 residential units, roughly 9,000 square feet of retail. Construction was set to begin in October 2025. The development was named Paragon. The carousel still turns beside the clock tower. The horses, some of them restored now to their 1928 colors, still rise and fall on their poles. Children ride them who have never heard of the giant coaster or the palm garden or the electric tower that once blazed with 20,000 lights above a saltwater lagoon. The organ plays the same songs it played when the Midway was full and the evening light came off the ocean and landed on the chain-link gates, warming the metal just enough that you could feel it on your palms as you pushed through.